Worked as a part-time lecturer and tutor at University College Cork, Ireland, and was a Government of Ireland scholar. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Liz Campbell.
Thank you very much, Michael, for those warm words of welcome, and to everybody here for being such wonderful colleagues for the few brief weeks that I've spent in Baltimore. Colleagues in Aberdeen have said to me certainly that both the combination of time spent with students and the flurry of social events that's put on for the Aberdeen lecturer means that the month there passes remarkably swiftly, and I certainly can say that that's the case. Just to I suppose, refer back to Michael's few words about me, I think Michael has given me an unexpected promotion in that I'm a lecturer at the University of Aberdeen rather than a senior one, although certainly if I've been promoted in my absence, I won't complain in that regard. And again, as Michael has outlined, while I'm working in Scotland and have been for more than 2 years now, my background is Irish criminal law. My PhD thesis looked at the legal responses in Ireland to organised crime, and my research, my ongoing postdoctoral research is focused. I can't lose everything. Yep. My ongoing postdoctoral research focuses on the Irish criminal justice system. I'm broadening it at the moment, drawing on my experience here to have a more comparative approach to my research, but what I'm going to speak about today is a work in progress, something I hope to submit in the coming weeks to the British Journal of Criminology, but it looks specifically at gun crime in Ireland and the legislative responses of Irish policymakers to this particular phenomenon. So the way I'll approach my presentation is hopefully to speak for around 30 minutes, and I would ask if a point I'm making needs clarification, or perhaps I'm presuming or presupposing some knowledge about the Irish criminal justice system, please do raise your hands. I'd be happy to take points of clarification throughout the presentation itself, and then after that 30 or so minutes we'll open it to the floor for discussion, because I'm sure many colleagues here have words to enlighten me and educate me about the situation in the US, and certainly that will be of influence to the situation in Ireland. So what I want to do today is just to speak first of all in a descriptive sense about the phenomenon of gun crime in Ireland, set out in an empirical way the statistics that pertain to gun crime, and explore whether or not there has been an increase as is commonly put forward in political and popular debate at the moment. So that would really be just setting the context. Moving on then from there, I want to look at the responses of the Irish government to the problem of gun crime, which is perceived as an increasing and ever serious, growing problem in terms of severity. And I'm going to classify those legal responses into under two broad rubrics, I suppose. First of all, I'm going to put forward the idea that the legal responses can be seen as emergency measures. First of all, the phenomenon is categorised as a crisis beyond anything we have ever conceived of before, and thus that emergency measures are warranted to deal with it appropriately. Secondly, I would argue that the response of the Irish state towards gun crime conceives of the actor in this regard as a rational one, who weighs up the costs and benefits of the actions, and so can be deterred in this rational sense. Going through this in an analytical sense, I'll also put forward some normative ideas as to whether or not I think these are sustainable approaches by the Irish government. And I suppose my conclusion, just to hint at it, is that while these understandings of the Irish state are justifiable, they're not complete. They lack a certain, I suppose, a broader view of gun crime is warranted. And this is where we may have to veer into questioning time as to whether I'll be able to deal with these matters in sufficient depth. But what I want to hint at the very end of my paper is the issues of relative deprivation and also of expressions of masculinity need to be taken into account. So extra legal matters ultimately need to be acknowledged by policymakers if gun crime is to be tackled adequately. And certainly, like I said, this is where I think colleagues from Baltimore and from the US more generally will be able to inform me and influence my paper. So just to set the scene for anyone who is unaware of the situation in Ireland in the context of guns, first of all, before looking at crime more generally. I suppose until very recently, the conventional view, both in a political, popular and academic sense really, is that Ireland had very, very low crime rates. We were talking up until the 50s or 60s of maybe single-figure murders happening in a year in a country of around 4 million people. So very, very low crime rates. Moving into the 70s and 80s, outside the realm of subversive crime, so beyond the IRA and so on, still crime rates were at very, very low levels. Not only were there very low crime rates in the country, there was and still is an unarmed police force. So of 15,000 police officers in Ireland, only 1,000 of these are armed. These are special police forces. Their arms would always be hidden, and these arms would only be used in specific exigent circumstances. There's no right to bear arms in Ireland. While we have a constitution, there is no mention of bearing of arms in that way. And gun ownership is governed by a very strict licensing scheme, which is operated by the National Police Force. So I suppose that's just setting the scene for you. So up until very recently, there just was no concern about gun crime in Ireland because it was seen to be a phenomenon that pertained to the US, maybe to the UK, but hadn't really darkened Ireland's doors as such. However, in the past decade, so from the late 1990s into this decade, we see an increase in policy debate, in legislative debate, and also in the popular media about the extent of gun crime in Ireland. So the commonly put forward, the propounded notion now is that gun crime in a broad sense is increasing. If we look into the political debates, we see things, comments such as the appearance of a variety of guns in the pursuit of crime has become commonplace, that there's been a proliferation in the past 10 years of guns in Irish society. And then this is probably the most hysterical of the comments I'll allude to here, saying that many of our urban areas are terrified by rampant gangland crime, which is apparently making huge swathes of the country ungovernable. So I think these comments are ones that could be translated to the UK and also to the US. Certainly the evoking of a sense of crisis. But if we delve into the criminal statistics about gun crime in a little bit more detail, we'd see that the situation is far more nuanced than these political comments would have us believe. So if we look to armed robbery and burglaries involving firearms, in fact, those rates have been decreasing in the past decade. If we look at possession of firearms and discharge of firearms, those crimes have been increasing, although there is a debate to be had in that respect as to whether this is due in part to more focused police practice. But certainly there does seem to be an increase in that regard. So we can see that there's fluctuation, and like I said, that there are nuances. It's not an across-the-board increase in gun crime, as is commonly put forward. However, what does seem to be most problematic, and which this notion will form the core of my paper here today, is homicides perpetrated by firearms. And this is certainly something which is pertinent in the US and Baltimore context, and it's something that is becoming increasingly central in relation to policy making in Ireland. So what I've just outlined to you here, just to give you a context about homicide rates more generally before we delve into homicides perpetrated by firearms, just to set out to you what the homicide rates are in Ireland at the moment. So what we've seen recently in the past 3 or 4 years is Ireland actually overtaking England and Wales in terms of homicide rate per 100,000 population. And this is the first time it's ever happened. And again, I think the word on the street, or the perception on the street, would be that Ireland still has lower crime rates, but in fact the statistics betray this notion, or undermine this notion. So we've seen Ireland coming past England and Wales, which nevertheless is surpassed greatly by the United States as a whole. And then I'm just looking at recent reports as to the number of murders that have been carried out in Baltimore this year, and this is just using my own calculations. The rate in Baltimore up to now this year is at around 26 deaths per 100,000 population, which is far in excess. So I think
Next one, does this take into account whether guns were used or not?
No, this is just across the board. This is all homicides. So I think this, first of all, possibly should give Irish policymakers pause to say, while there is a problem in a broad sense in relation to crime, it's certainly not at the same level that pertains in other jurisdictions or in other areas. However, what we have seen in Ireland, and which is of more concern really, even though the homicide rate remains pretty low, is that the proportion of these murders that are being carried out in Ireland is rising. And I think this is particularly problematic given the likelihood of fatality by any injuries caused by such weapons, the potential for harm to others in the context of such actions, and moreover the fact that convictions and even detection rates are far lower for murders perpetrated by guns than murders across the board. So just again to outline this to you using some tables, I don't want to blind you with PowerPoint today, but I think just to set the scene before we delve into the theoretical matters, I think it's useful to outline this. So what you can see, for those of you close enough, down the left-hand side is just years, so the past 10 years, the past decade, and then outlining the total number of homicides, which were perpetrated by firearms, and then just calculating from that the percentage of those, the percentage of homicides which involved firearms. So you can see in the past 10 years that we've seen a leap from less than 10% of homicides being carried out by firearms in Ireland to around 40%. And while one could quibble with this and say that the figures are so low that this is not statistically significant, what we have seen is an increase. You can see there is fluctuations from year to year, but we've gone from single figures essentially of a percentage up to somewhere usually between the 20 and 40% mark. And this is emphasised by policymakers in stating that this is a crisis beyond which has ever been experienced in Ireland before, and so is one which is is a type of crisis which warrants more robust measures, shall we say. I've also in this table, just for purposes of information, I suppose, and for purposes of comparison, have included the rates for England and Wales, given that it's the closest jurisdiction, and given that it's very, there are great similarities culturally speaking, in that there is an unarmed police force, again, no right to bear arms, and generally speaking, I suppose, around average crime rates in terms of the EU more generally. And what you can see here is that in the past decade there has been not as great fluctuations, but moreover there hasn't been this steep increase. We're still on average seeing in England and Wales single figure homicides which involve firearms. So that, I suppose, one could flag up as one indicator which would suggest that more robust or even repressive measures are warranted to deal with the situation in Ireland. So that I think we can agree to some extent anyway with the political claim in Ireland that that the severity and extent of the problem of gun homicides is something that needs to be dealt with swiftly and robustly. What we've also seen, if we delve into the statistics, is a change in both the victims, or the type of victims, and the type of perpetrators of homicides in recent years in Ireland. Research carried out by the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland between 2001 and 2005 on the victims of gun homicides have said that around 66%, so 2/3 of victims of gun murders between those 2 years were what is euphemistically termed in Ireland known to the police. So this is either people who have convictions or else who have come to the attention of the police before, or who are known to associate with convicted people. So first of all, we've seen a shift, I suppose, in the types of people who are being murdered. Secondly, what we've also seen, I suppose, not only have we seen a change in the type of victims of gun crimes, but we've seen a change in the perpetrators and the means of perpetrating gun homicides. If we delve back into the police reports from the 60s, 70s and 80s, very usefully they would outline a basic factual scenario really of each murder, because there were so few of them occurring. A synopsis could be given, and what we can see is those few murders that did occur in Ireland, and fewer again those which did occur involving guns, were generally speaking crimes of passion, crimes between people who were already related or in some type of relationship, and oftentimes disputes over land formed the basis for this. So murders perpetrated by shotguns, maybe out on a farm in rural Ireland. But like I said, the Royal College of Surgeons shows to us that the types of victims has changed. Secondly, we've seen the types of perpetrators changing somewhat, in that oftentimes these offences are carried out by more than one individual. They generally involve a greater level of planning, and then I suppose associated with this or leading on from this is that there are far lower detection rates.
Well, you sort of touched upon what I was going to ask. With the increase in the percentage of homicides, did you do a comparison between a premeditated, deliberate, first-degree type murder as opposed to a manslaughter type killing due to some type of provocation? At least in our country, when we talk about homicides, we sort of separate homicides from within
Sure.
homicides, murders and manslaughter.
Sure, I take your point absolutely, and no, I bracket them both in together, essentially due to the available statistics that were there for
And you
me.
don't know if there's an increase in more of the murders, the premeditated killings versus increase in manslaughter type killing?
I don't, I'd have
You
to
don't?
look that up
Okay.
for you, but
Okay.
again, as I said, I suppose I should have entered this caveat at the start. The statistics upon which I am relying as to homicides involving firearms, that's not publicly available on police reports. One has to delve actually into political commentary or political debates.
So it's just
so
some
it's
type
just-
of unlawful
it's
killing?
but involving guns, yeah. I
Okay.
take your point though,
Okay.
and that's certainly something I have to investigate in future.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you.
Sort of in the same vein, I think I see from here that the total number of homicides in 98 and 2008 is pretty close, right? It's 51 and 52.
Yes.
So I don't know if this is what you're going to address now, but I mean, is it your sense that it sounds like the number is pretty steady, it's just a proportion.
Sure. Yes.
So sort of it seems like it could be something having to do with this premeditation issue, like the people who, it's easier to kill someone with a gun maybe, or harder if you have to obtain it, if it's harder to obtain it. But I guess my question is, how do you explain that the total number of homicides, it's surprising to me that the total number of homicides is constant, but the number of guns in the society has gone up.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and that's the very point that is made by policymakers, that we can see that when we take a step back, essentially the total number of homicides is static, but you can see the rates involving firearms has gone up by 5, and whether these are premeditated or more, I suppose, could be better categorised as manslaughter. This is seen as what necessitates more robust measures, and it's certainly very difficult to understand, given that there hasn't been any change in licensing laws, why exactly this has come about. And what I will try to argue as we go through is that while the Irish state or Irish policymakers, I suppose, are right in one respect in saying that the problem is getting worse, it's the way they're going about addressing it, which is problematic, or which is unduly thin, I suppose, in its conception of what the actor is conceiving of. But yeah, I think that's a very good point, and it's something I probably should have flagged up myself. So you can see that we're still talking about around one murder a week, which in a jurisdiction with around 4 million people is generally not too bad.
I mean,
Sure,
do they give me solace in the decline? Must be some decline in non-gun homicide.
Absolutely, absolutely, and the very point was made to me by a colleague as to whether the actual means of perpetrating a murder or a homicide, whether that is of any comfort or not, or of any difference.
Do you happen to know the percentage of gun homicides in the United States?
I don't, and it's something I have to look
I
up.
would just guess it'd be well in excess of 50%.
Yeah.
And I suppose the point could be made then that if it's well in excess of 50% in the US, what is it about Ireland that is a state with low gun ownership
Gun
and an
control
unarmed,
law.
and very robust gun control laws, and then nevertheless ends up around the 30-40% of gun homicides?
Just on the data about the, I mean, that is interesting about that the number of homicides seem to be constant, but I was just actually looking at the last few years. Actually, if you go from 2003, let's say, 51, 45, 45, and it jumps up to, or 65, I'm sorry, 60, and then is that 80 or 89?
89,
It
yeah.
may be that 2008 is actually an anomalous drop, so you would really want to see what happens in 2009.
Sure.
So in fact, there may be a correlation with the increase in firearms and the homicides.
Sure,
You
sure.
have to worry about whether that's an outlier or not.
Sure. That's a good point. So, so the point to which I should return before outlining the kind of theoretical framework for my paper here today is that we have, we certainly have an increase in the proportion of homicides which involve firearms. We have a change in the type of people who are being targeted in such murders, and moreover, the perpetrators, like I said, are more likely to be acting in conjunction with each other. These murders are more likely, or the homicides are more likely to be planned. And what we've seen then is a significant decrease in detection rates, and then obviously an associated consequence of this, lower prosecution and conviction rates also. So I've outlined this to you. What I've done is I've removed the column from the previous table which outlined the homicides involving firearms, and then again trawling through parliamentary debates, I've found out how many of these were actually detected by the police. So this isn't necessarily prosecutions being initiated, but it's the police being able to flag up a suspect, or to have a significant idea as to who a possible perpetrator was. And what you can see in the past decade, again, there's some movement from year to year, but we're moving up to around 20 murders, or 20 homicides, excuse me, per year perpetrated by firearms. And you have a detection rate dropping from 75% in 1998 down to somewhere around the 30% mark. And as a means of comparison, the detection rate for homicides more generally in Ireland is usually above 80%. So while we see 10 years ago the homicides involving firearms was around on a par with murders and homicides more generally, we've seen a significant decrease there. And you can see even then moving over to the column on the right of the percentages, the amount of these acts which involve proceedings being commenced and moreover convictions being found in court is decreasing also. So if we look through the parliamentary debates in Ireland and we look to the popular media, we see these figures being put forward as evidence to the fact that while crime rates may not be increasing across the board, this particular type of gun crime is something that warrants very robust measures. And what the Irish state has done is it's amended existing measures, it's emulated robust measures which were in place in the past, and it's introduced very robust sentences to deal with this type of crime. And what I want to do just for the next 10 minutes or so is to divide those reactions of the Irish state, try to theorise them in some respect, and then give my own assessment as to why I think they're lacking, and ultimately then give my own I suppose, suggestions as to what could be incorporated, or what the Irish state should be cognizant of in seeking to deal with this type of gun criminality. So like I hinted at the very start, the two categories, or the two rubrics I want to bracket the reactions under, are firstly an emergency paradigm in which the Irish state uses these statistics to say this is a crisis we've never dealt with before, and so emergency measures are warranted. And secondly, it categorises the gun criminal, more particularly the individual involved in serious gun crime, as a rational actor that is instrumental in his or her acts, and so can be deterred in a cost-benefit analysis. So in the context of invoking a state of emergency, you see the Ministers for Justice mentioning with comments such as the drug and gun culture poses as significant a threat to the well-being of the Irish state as the paramilitaries did ever in the course of their campaign. We have Ireland being compared to Colombia, such as the height of murders in this modern European state. We can see talk about increase in gangland killings being enormous and inordinate, and so on. I don't need to harp on this point any longer, but we've a perception that the problem is beyond that which has ever been dealt with before. So what we've seen in the reaction of the Irish state to this type of crime can be subdivided into two further categories. First of all, the Irish state has used measures that were first used against the IRA and other paramilitary groups. It's just directly used that exact legislation against gun criminals. And I'll talk about that for a moment or two. Secondly, what we've seen Irish legislators do is to copy measures that were once used against the IRA, and to use them in a broader sense against anyone suspected of gun criminality. Because of the threat that was posed to Irish society throughout the 20th century, legislation was introduced in 1939 under the Offences Against the State Act, which allowed Irish policymakers to introduce a state of emergency, or even if measures weren't seen as that, or even if the situation was not seen as that severe, it allowed for abrogation of certain procedural rights, it allowed for non-jury trials and so on. So that was in 1939, but this piece of legislation is still in existence nowadays. And the most standard understanding of the Offences Against the State Act 1939 is that it pertains to terrorist offences. So offences which threaten the existence of the state or threaten the safety and security of the Irish people as a whole. But in a rather, I suppose one could say, cynical and probably ingenious mode, the Irish legislatures included what is called a schedule to the Act, which means that non-terrorist offences can essentially be subsumed under the Act, and so the measures that the Act allows, such as limiting procedural rights and so on, can pertain to offences which are not terrorist acts at all. And one of these categories of crimes which is included in the schedule are, as you can imagine given the topic of my talk, are gun crimes. Crimes that are related to firearms are scheduled under the 1939 Act. And what this means is that these, certainly by anybody's standards, repressive measures which are essentially meant to be used against terrorist offences can be and are used against gun criminals. So what we have here is matters such as arrest without reasonable suspicion being required, as is normally the case in the criminal justice system. So that is allowed under the Offences Against the State Act. So a person suspected of a gun crime could be arrested without any reasonable suspicion being required, and can be searched and ultimately charged without, as I said, without reasonable suspicion. If an individual is arrested for a gun crime under the 1939 Act, he or she can be detained for 72 hours rather than 24, which is the norm if he or she was arrested under I suppose, ordinary criminal justice legislation, so to speak. So what this means is that gun homicide investigations, or the police investigating such types of crime, can use this 1939 Act, notwithstanding the fact that there is no link between the gun homicides and terrorist or subversive acts per se. And we can see as we go through the popular debate in the media that this is used broadly, and the most recent statistics I can find is that around 600 people a year are arrested under this. And given that the perceived threat of the IRA is diminishing, it certainly seems that this is being used more broadly against those involved in non-terrorist activity. We've also seen it being used against minors, so individuals under the age of 18 have been arrested, detained under this anti-subversive legislation. In addition to this, I suppose, more robust the more robust measures available to the state in terms of arresting and detaining somebody, there is also a limitation on the right of the accused to silence if he or she is detained under this 1939 Act. So what the 1939 Act allows is for the police to require an individual to give the officer information about his whereabouts at a particular time, or any information this individual has about the perpetration of an offence under the Act by anybody else. And failure to adhere to this request or giving false information is something that an individual could be imprisoned for up to 6 months. So this goes far beyond inference drawing provisions. This is actually a serious limitation on the right to silence. And again, because gun crimes are scheduled under the Act, these measures can be used. And certainly these sections under the 1939 Act have been challenged in our most superior constitutional court, and they've been found to be constitutional. And again, both from parliamentary debates and popular accounts, we can see that these measures are used against gun criminals. So that is, I suppose, the first prong of my emergency paradigm argument, and that what we can see is the Irish state just literally translating or transposing measures that were once used against terrorists to use them now against gun criminals. And this is deeply problematic if one is concerned about the civil liberties of any individuals. Moreover, what we can see, and I can see time is running away from me, so I just want to gloss over this and just outline it for you, and it's something we can delve into in more detail in the questions. What we've also seen, in addition to this direct use of anti-terrorist measures, is an emulation, I suppose, of these measures in more recent legislation. So I mentioned earlier, prolonged detention was allowed under the 1939 Act. That now has been replicated in a 2007 Act, which allows for 7-day detention, which is one of the longest periods of detention in Europe allowed for any type of serious criminality. But this is for murder involving a firearm, false imprisonment involving a firearm. 7-day detention is allowed under more recent legislation. One then, if one wants to put this in a theoretical context, we could look to Oren Gross's arguments speaking about the normalization of the extraordinary, where something that was once seen as unpalatable is now seen as acceptable because of its existence in the past. And I suppose, moreover, that increasing doses or dosages are required if there has been such robust measures in place previously to deal with any new crisis that comes along. So it's the low detection rates, it's the increase in the proportions of gun homicides, I think, which has allowed policymakers to extend these measures in this regard. I can see time is getting away, but again, just to mention, maybe David Garland here is one theorist, I think, who can maybe illuminate why these measures have been seen to be acceptable in the Irish context. And Garland invokes a criminology of the other, where there's a demarcation between us and them, so to speak. And again, I think this demarcation between the gun criminal and the law-abiding majority is made particularly easy in Ireland, given that up until recently crime rates have been so low, there is a low level of gun ownership and so on. So I think this possibly indicates, or is further indication as to why these robust measures are seen as acceptable in Ireland. So the second way I want to characterise the reaction of the Irish state to gun crime is through, I suppose, a purely instrumental understanding of the acts, which leads to a view, excuse me, of the criminal actor as being a purely rational one. And I suppose this logic is one which is really that which pertains to the criminal justice system as a whole, that unless proved otherwise, the individual is rational. He or she is a reasoning calculator who will weigh up the pros and cons, the pain and pleasure of a particular act, and so can be deterred from committing a particular act if the pain is increased, so to speak. But what I would say is that this understanding of the gun criminal is unduly narrow, and if the Irish state restricts itself to such a conception, that it will be very difficult to deal with this very serious social problem. Nevertheless, while I would dispute the, I suppose, centrality given by the Irish state to this rational actor paradigm, I would say that it's understandable as to why the Irish state has come to such a conclusion, due to the fact that there is a proven link between the market in illegal drugs in Ireland and the perpetration of gun homicides. And this mirrors theoretical analyses that have been put forward by Goldstein in the US, and also then by Hales and other theorists in the UK. And certainly if we look to Empirical data also, we can see that there is a link between guns and drugs in Ireland. Oftentimes they are imported together, and so seizures will involve both such illegal matters. And certainly if we look to the Customs Services reports also, there will be an emphasis on the fact that there is a link between the two. So I suppose my point here is that it's understandable as to why the Irish state would see gun crime as instrumental and as rational in nature, given that there seems to be a link between it and gun markets.
Shouldn't that also give them an argument, going back to your first point, of making the schedules, making this equivalent to terrorism, if you make the assumption that although there's some single drug dealers out there, you're generally dealing with gangs and cartels which have look a lot more like terrorist cells than they do individual criminals breaking and entering, for example, and would therefore be at least one argument for using the methods that you used with the for terrorism for organized crime as opposed to disorganized crime.
Sure, that's a very persuasive point, and it's something that possibly could be seen as applicable maybe in the context of other jurisdictions, but what we've seen in the context of Ireland certainly is that the types of groups that are involved in this are probably more correctly called disorganized groups, and that while in the past the IRA would have a definite hierarchy and would have had meetings and so on, and so maybe would be more equivalent to cartels in other jurisdictions, what we're dealing with in Ireland hasn't attained that level of severity. Moreover, I would say that maybe the conception that you put forward of organised groups in other countries is convincing due to the fact that the state is under threat. But again, in Ireland, we haven't seen any threats posed to the judiciary or any other agents or actors of the state. So again, it hasn't reached that level of severity yet. But that's something that would have to be dealt with if things do reach such a crisis. I suppose I could also make the rather tangential point that there is a possibility for the Irish state, both under the European Convention on Human Rights, but also under the Irish Constitution, to declare an emergency if things have reached that level of severity, and that choice hasn't been taken. So Dysenhouse speaks about grey holes and black holes where legality is left by the wayside, and this is certainly a grey hole in that the Irish state is circumventing to a degree these procedural norms, but isn't coming out right and saying that there is an emergency per se. But I certainly take your point. So what we've seen here is I suppose an understanding that gun crime is linked to drugs crime, and so due to the fact that the drugs trade, I suppose, being beyond the realm of legal regulation, that recourse to violence and to gun violence more particularly is a necessary component of successful drug dealing. And based upon this, the Irish state has called for deterrent sentences on an understanding that such criminals can be deterred. Calls for robust deterrent sentences have been seen in Ireland through the 80s and 90s, but it wasn't until 2006 that presumptive robust sentences were introduced for gun crime. And the reason there was such hesitation in terms of introducing these types of sentences is that Ireland has a written constitution and moreover has a constitutional demand of proportionality in sentencing, which would take both the characteristics of the offender and of the offence into account. So while if we look to parliamentary debate there are many calls for mandatory sentences, that is actually just constitutionally impossible in Ireland due to the fact that there is a requirement of proportionality in sentencing. So what we have now are presumptive sentences. But these presumptive sentences cannot be imposed if there are certain extraordinary circumstances which would warrant a more lenient sentence. So we've seen presumptive sentences for possession of firearms with intent to endanger life or cause serious injury, using a firearm in the course of arrest, using a firearm in the context of false imprisonment, shortening the barrel of a shotgun, and so on. So these are all measures which have presumptive sentences, but the political drive was for mandatory sentences, but this wasn't possible in a constitutional sense. And if we look to any of the political debate on these matters, we can see there is certainly a very strong understanding of the actor as being one who can be deterred. We see comments such as, if a criminal knows he will get 15 years in prison for firing a gun, he might think twice before he pulls the trigger. Comments such as, it is timely that criminals fear our criminal justice system, and then we need to send a clear message to members of criminal gangs that crime does not pay. Again, rhetoric, I think, which can be seen in very many jurisdictions. But what I would like to put forward here, just for a few moments, is that my view that this conception of the gun criminal is unduly simplistic, and this is borne out by empirical studies that have been carried out both in the US and in the UK involving individuals who carry out armed robberies or other gun-related crimes. Matthews, Morrison, O'Donnell, I can list out various names, have been involved in qualitative interviews with armed robbers and those involved in gun homicides, and they have found that, generally speaking, there is very little rational either comprehension or calculation involved in the perpetration of such offences. One could maybe allude to Hershey, who spoke about rational choice in crime, and he put forward a more moderate view of rational choice in crime and said, whereas there may be rational choice in the specifics of a particular crime itself, the ultimate decision to be involved in criminality per se very rarely involves rational matters and is more likely to be influenced by relative deprivation or perhaps other external structural or positivistic factors. So maybe we can say, drawing on the qualitative data and drawing on Hershey, that while the ins and outs or the technicalities of a particular gun crime can maybe be influenced by rational matters, in a broader sense the perpetration of gun crime is more likely to be influenced by extra legal or external factors such as relative deprivation and expressions of masculinity. And I can see my promise to speak for around 40 minutes has swiftly gone out the window, so I'll really only hint at this, and I can also see from the questions earlier that I think there'll be very many comments, so I don't want to occupy all the time here. But the two theories, I suppose, two criminological theories that can help our understanding of gun crime in Ireland, first of all, are the relative deprivation thesis, and secondly, the expression of masculinity hypothesis. In the context of relative deprivation, we've seen since the 50s theorists such as Merton and more recently Elliot Curry speaking about the fact that serious and violent crimes seem to be most at the highest levels in very unequal societies, and certainly that, I think that is borne out in the context of the United States, where you have a great disparity in terms of income. And I suppose the point has also been made that this inequality leads to a lack of social cohesion, which is very important in keeping crime rates down. And some of you may have heard about what is often titled the Celtic Tiger in Ireland, where we had a dramatic increase in gross domestic product over the past maybe 15 to 10 years. There was a great increase in wealth, but again, emulating the United States, what we've seen is the point was very wryly made that a rising tide raises all yachts rather than raises all boats. You had some people become very wealthy, others not at all. And what we can see, perhaps related to this, if not caused by this, is this leap in gun crime as well. And looking then across the Irish Sea to the UK, we can see theorists like Marshall and Hayes say, yes, that gun crime is proven to be most high in those areas where you have an intersection of poverty, unemployment and an urban milieu. And certainly when we look to the statistics in Ireland, it's Dublin and Limerick, which is another city which is characterised by great poverty, which are the two hotspots of gun crime. It's something I won't have time to delve into here, but these statistics that I mentioned to you are not, they cannot be spread evenly across the country, rather they're targeted in our capital city, which is, I suppose, has pockets of drugs problems, pockets of very high unemployment, and similarly this is mirrored in Limerick on the west of the country also. So this is something maybe we can discuss in the context of Baltimore and the US more generally. Is it this intersection of these social factors that really needs to be taken into account? And this is certainly something that hasn't been addressed in Ireland thus far. Certainly, Professor Anderson.
I just want to put an observation.
Sure.
That confuses me in this country, so perhaps you can think about it in the context of this fledgling system that's trying to address the problem. we have a gun problem in this country, but there's also a problem of competing rights, which I don't think we have in Ireland, where there are those who say, I want a right to my firearm. Now maybe this ties into the masculinity issues that, I get a right to kill anyone that comes at me. And so while we're dealing with that, the tension of gun violence, whatever you think about it, there's a senator from Mississippi who wants people to carry guns on trains because they want to take their guns hunting. I guess in New York and Boston is where they're going to go hunting. But when I was listening to this, I'm sitting here thinking, my students, listening to this, maybe one of them might ask me, well, what's up with that, Professor Anderson? I have to tell you that it sounds to me that the rhetoric side of this is actually pretty equal to what's going on in the United States, just the priorities are a little different. And so, just as you go forward with sort of looking at this, it may be that the issue is being perceived that you're doing something about a problem that maybe can't really be fixed. I imagine in most industrialized countries, if I were to look at the numbers, industrialized country doesn't have unusual criminal circumstances. Your homicide rates are probably going to be stable because, basically there's a certain percentage of the population that will kill and murder and fall in love and kill. And, there's kind of a stable core of those people, and there's everyone else who won't. And then these economic factors may actually play in, but the political responses, don't make sense. One group here in the country says the more guns, the safer we'll be. So if everyone's armed, then everyone will be nervous that you might get killed if you try to do a gun crime. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but there are people in this country who really believe that. And then they'll show statistics that say, look at the low homicide rate in such and such a state where everybody's armed. And so that argument holds water long enough for the legislative response to be things like mandatory sentence. Although you can't have it constitutionally, that they still want the idea that people will be deterred by greater sentence and so forth. So I'm not sure the problem is necessarily as different, it's just when politicians are involved. I just sort of throw that out because as I'm listening to you discuss how it's being dealt with in Ireland, other than a group of people in our country wanting the constitutional right to bear arms and thinking that is the safety feature, at the same time, the politicians all sound the same.
Absolutely, I certainly accept your point in that regard, and I suppose what we have in Ireland, unfortunately, as a small jurisdiction, is a trend of policy transfer. So it's either looking to England in one direction or looking the other direction to the US and importing importing tactics that don't necessarily translate or that cannot be transposed very well. But I would probably disagree in one respect as to whether the problem is on a par or is equivalent in both jurisdictions, given that it is really only very recently that we've seen this change in Ireland, and that's why there is such, I suppose, a frantic air to the policy making in terms of, well, how do we go back to the way things were in good old Ireland, without being facetious, but that is it, and that the crime rates in terms of property crimes aren't changing so much, but we have seen this real spike in gun-related homicides. And unfortunately, Irish policymakers aren't being very creative and instead are emulating matters that are tactics, I suppose, that haven't really been proven to work here. And certainly in the context of mandatory sentences in Virginia and New York, we've seen the research of which I'm aware is saying that it's the I suppose the existence or the stability of drug markets, the consumption and sale of drugs such as crack, that this has more relevance to the gun homicide rates rather than any measures introduced by the government. And that's, I suppose, why I would advocate a broader, maybe for want of a better word, a more holistic extra-legal approach that takes relative deprivation into account, because again this is a phenomenon that has worsened in Ireland recently and possibly could be remedied. And then leading to my very last point, and this may perhaps probably will evoke more questions, is this matter of the expression of masculinity. And again, this is where I certainly have no prescriptions or any conclusions, any firm conclusions to make, but rather it's to say that there is somewhat of an intersection, I suppose, between relative deprivation and the expression of masculinity, because it's the absence of a legitimate means of expressing masculinity for some young men that leads to gun violence and to gun homicide more specifically. So again, referring back to the qualitative data I alluded to earlier, Matthews, who has interviewed many armed robbers in the UK, has said that rational choice really can't come into play here, and that these interviews carried out with these men shows that there is an active pursuit of risk and danger, that there's a desire for, I suppose, bravado, and there's a desire to express aggression in such a way. And certainly, again, this reiterates points that have been made by many other people in relation to crime more broadly, but there are very few women involved in gun homicides in Ireland. And like I said, in relation to relative deprivation, the gun homicides and gun crime is centred in particular areas. So it certainly seems to be the absence of a legitimate means of expressing masculinity that could explain or go some way towards explaining the perpetrations of such crime. So theorists such as Messerschmitt, Hattie and so on have said that where means of accomplishing masculinity in a legal or legitimate sense are limited, violence can be seen as a strategy of accomplishing or expressing masculinity. And it's a type of masculinity that is a very, I suppose, a fragile and unpleasant interpretation of what it is, that invokes a type of tribalism as such, and that this maybe the Irish state needs to be cognizant of this in perhaps developing educational approaches rather than focusing on legal factors per se. So I'll wrap things up there and open it up for questions, because I know some people are going to rush off to lectures very soon. Sure.
I guess the thing that's confusing to me about this is if the number of homicides has not increased dramatically at least, or it's somewhat stable, but the percentage of gun crimes has increased, how can you say that gun crime is attributable to the deprivation thesis or the masculinity thesis? Because the total number of crimes is still somewhat stable. So how are you linking it to firearms? Do you see what I mean?
I do. I take your point, and I think it's a very perceptive one. My answer to that would be that it's been proven in England and Wales that gun crime is related, first of all, to drugs markets, which are certainly on the increase in Ireland. Secondly, that there's an intersection with relative deprivation, which again is on the increase in Ireland. And I take your point that maybe that your contention undermines my masculinity thesis somewhat, but it's something I'll have to explore in a bit more detail. So you would think that if my central theories were sustainable, that in fact there should be an increase across the board.
Unless there's something special about guns,
yes,
that somehow is overriding other ways of killing.
Well,
sure. Just maybe if I could just respond very briefly, I think the point has been made that I suppose the use of a gun has both instrumental and symbolic effect in terms of the expression of masculinity. So for an individual involved in the gun market, it could be, on one understanding, a very rational act to carry and to use a gun, and that's its instrumental purpose. But moreover, just interpreting it in that way is unduly narrow, and so it can be the expression of masculinity because this individual doesn't have a way of expressing that in any other matter. I hope that's not too trite an answer, and you've certainly given me plenty to think about. Thank you. Thanks.
following up on that, it's the involvement of handguns or guns that I find of interest here. Is it perhaps just a question of freer availability of handguns? In my high school class of 40 boys, 2 have committed suicide with guns. That's 5%. It's just a lot easier to kill somebody with a gun than it is to kill them any other way. Just pull the trigger and they're gone. I take it the homicide rates don't include suicide rates?
No.
Is there a change in suicide rates at the same time?
There is
and
actually.
How do they kill themselves?
There is an increase in homicide rates amongst young men.
No, I'm looking at suicide.
Sorry, excuse me, and that's my own verbal slip there. I meant to say suicide rates. There has been an increase in suicide rates amongst young men.
And are they killing themselves? How?
To the best of my knowledge, there isn't an increase in gun suicide rates, but it's something I'll have to delve into in a little bit more detail. The point has been made, referring back to this idea of hegemonic masculinity or expression of masculinity, that the growing suicide rate is an unpleasant repercussion of this. But again, that's a matter I'll have to look into in more detail. Thank you for your point. Sure, yes, that's you.
One way in which the argument about the rationality of crime has been used in a different manner in this country is as follows. You talked about people growing up in underprivileged areas, and therefore I guess that negates, in your mind, the idea that the crime is a rational crime, or at least takes away from the likelihood that it's a rational crime.
I suppose makes it less likely that, it limits the range of choices available to
Okay,
that individual.
that's fair enough, and that it calls for holistic approaches, I think, is certainly sensible. The argument you hear here in this country is that somebody grows up in that environment and they have a choice of going into the drug culture of selling drugs and using guns, which absolutely have to be used if you're a drug dealer in most inner cities. And the choice to do that is not an irrational choice, because given the limitations of what their possibilities are, because of the situation in which they grew up, it's a perfectly rational choice to choose to become a drug dealer rather than working at McDonald's for the rest of one's life. So the way in which that society can influence that choice in a positive direction is by making, one, the likelihood of apprehension, but also the penalty severe enough so that influences the choice in a rational way. The person decides not to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a point I should have alluded to myself. O'Donnell and other theorists, both in Ireland and in the UK, that were involved in qualitative analysis of rational choices, have said that was the one rational choice factor that came into play, the likelihood of detection and the likelihood of conviction. And that's been borne out in other jurisdictions also. And then referring back to this screen here, you can see because the detection rates are falling, it's deeply problematic for the Irish state. That's the one rational, I suppose, the one hook on which a rational choice could be engaged with, yeah. So again, this hopefully would lend weight to my suggestion that it should be a more holistic, extra-legal and, I suppose, resource-intensive approach adopted by the Irish state, rather than a strictly legal one, which seems far too narrow. That's it, yeah, good point. Sure, I think maybe the hand here, in the back,
It's a quick
certainly.
question. On the rational actor point, has there been a spike in defensive firearm-related materials, bulletproof vests, these kind of things? If there are, it would suggest there is some rationality going on.
Again, this is something I haven't looked at, and I don't know. I suppose.
And is it illegal to buy that in Ireland? Can you buy bulletproof vests?
No, one cannot, and one certainly does see media reports of individuals wearing bulletproof vests to court. There is also an entity called the Criminal Assets Bureau, which is involved in civil asset forfeiture. So it seizes in a civil procedure assets from suspected criminals, and oftentimes you will see in the reports that these are they're seizing, let's say, Mercedes or high-level cars, and they're armor plated. So yeah, that's a very provocative point. It's something I haven't thought about. And again, given the lack of empirical data in Ireland, I certainly don't think I have any empirical data on that matter to refer to. But it's given me pause for thought. Thank you.
Before I ask my question, a clarification. How long ago was it that they scheduled gun crimes to be treated as terrorist crimes?
From day one, actually.
No, I mean, oh, I see.
From
Okay,
1939,
okay.
yes.
Because,
yeah.
I mean, I guess what I see there is that not only from the lower detection rates, but also the abysmal conviction rates, which are they're about 7% over the last 10 years. Those, at least for gun homicides, those draconian methods, if conviction is your goal, aren't working. Now maybe they're working better on other crimes, or maybe they're being used more for the harassment of criminals as opposed to the conviction of criminals. But they certainly don't seem to be resulting in convictions.
No, I think that is absolutely true, because one could say, so in I suppose, a normative sense, one can disagree with the use of such tactics, and then also say in a more pragmatic sense that they certainly don't seem to be working. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Right, Liz, I just wonder on that, sort of a follow-up to that, because you've got such aggressive, seeking out of people suspected of gun crimes. If you could comment on two things. One is whether, in fact, those people might plead out to some lower crime that wouldn't show up as a gun crime, which is what our mandatory gun sentences enable us to get. For often, the prosecution can get a plea to a lesser crime so that the defendant avoids the mandatory sentence. And secondly, whether you're seeing, or you can comment on whether there's witness intimidation, whether there are fewer citizens who will come forward and testify against what they perceive as gang criminality.
Absolutely. Well, just to refer to the first matter, I suppose I would have to say I'm not aware of I'm not aware of the level of pleading out to lower crimes as such. Given that the statistics I'm relying on here are police statistics, this isn't I suppose I'm referring here to homicides as recorded by the police rather than as recorded by the court. So hopefully that would remedy that problem to a certain extent. But I do take your point that if people are opting out of, or are pleading to lower crimes,
right,
then they're avoiding the mandatory sentences as such, is it?
Right, and they're not being reported as a conviction necessarily under this rubric, as conviction of a homicide or conviction of a gun crime.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
just saying that's certainly
That's the case. Yeah.
Pardon?
Happens a lot less.
Happens a lot. Their pleas
A lot less.
are not done as frequently.
No,
in
no.
Scotland for sure. they're
No,
not done.
certainly not.
But I don't
No.
know about Ireland.
No, and I'll have to delve into that in a bit more detail, but I imagine it would be very, very unlikely that the prosecution would accept a non-homicide plea. So it would either be maybe manslaughter rather than murder per se, but that would still then fall under this broader category. As regards to your second point about witness intimidation, again, the lack of empirical data is somewhat unsatisfying in Ireland, but if we look to city prosecutors and media reports, there are claims that there has been an increase in witness intimidation recently, and what we have seen is an introduction of various measures such as screening of witnesses, although there is no debate as to the use of anonymous witness evidence, which has recently been under discussion in England and Wales and Scotland at the moment. And in fact, I'm going to be talking, if anybody is free tomorrow, I'm going to be talking in Maryland about witness intimidation. Again, so I suppose the very first caveat or first point I would make is that there's an unsatisfying lack of data as to how many cases either don't get to court or how many cases fall due to witness intimidation. Very recently, though, there was a murder in Limerick City involving a gentleman whose family were testifying against a crime gang. So it is certainly a very real problem. But what is noteworthy is that while the anonymous witness approach is being grappled with at the moment in the UK, it's not being delved into at all in Ireland. Again, I'm not sure of the lie of the land in terms of witness intimidation protections in the US, but I imagine due to the right to confrontation, it wouldn't be conceived of anonymous approaches.
No, it wouldn't be. I don't know what you even mean by the anonymous witness approach. So
Unless you're a terrorist.
Interesting to hear.
Yeah. But this was it culminated. I can see that the time is running away from us. But it culminated in last year in the House of Lords, where a conviction in the case of Orr versus Davis for 2 murders was overturned on the basis that the only evidence against this man, which had been approved by the Court of Appeal, I should add, the only evidence against this man was given by anonymous witnesses. So their names, their identity, and any cross-examination which could reveal that was hidden from the court. This was ultimately overturned.
Okay, we're going to have to bring it to a close right now because some of our members have classes they have to go to. However, I'm sure Professor Campbell will be glad to remain to speak a little bit longer when anybody has issues they'd like to pursue, and she's still here a couple of days longer. I would like to formally thank you with a memento of your visit here, the official Center for International and Comparative Law tote bag. Also, the latest volume in the Jus Gentium series, which is the internationalization of law and legal education. And I'd also like, when you go back to Scotland, to keep in mind that this series, I don't know that all of our faculty members know this, it's published in connection with Springer, which is one of the biggest academic presses around the world. And we are now looking to publish monographs in the series as well as our usual proceedings of the European American Consortium for Legal Education. So, for example, your dissertation has not been already, I think it's already been published, hasn't it?
No.
It has not been? Well,
In fragments, I suppose one should say.
oh, okay,
diced
well,
it up,
I don't know if
but,
it's appropriate, but we are looking for that kind of work. So I'd like to give you that.
Thank you
So,
very
thank you very much.